Imagine, demand and build a world transformed.
Hi everyone, welcome to the World Transformed 2020 and our panel Connected Crises, Climate Care and COVID-19. As the title suggests, we're going to be discussing just how crises of care and climate change have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll consider the role of care work and care ethics in creating a sustainable society founded in climate justice. These questions are among those our series of panelists are going to explore with us. I'll be your chair. My name is Lola Faikin, and I'm a youth activist with the UK Student Climate Network, which is the grassroots organisation that hosts the youth climate strikes across England and Wales. Before we begin, I have a few announcements to make. So in this session, we'll be using a live transcription service called Otter. Attendees using Otter will have to follow a link and open the transcript as a separate window. The link will be shared in the chat box by a tech volunteer. And if you're having any difficulties, please message a tech volunteer on the chat. Secondly, TWT is free to all, but is only made possible by the contributions of our supporters. If you're able to, please consider joining our supporter network and supporting us at theworldtransformed.org/support to help us sustain our work all year round. Finally, whether online or in physical spaces, the World Transformed Festival is about creating an environment where people can learn and debate with each other in a spirit of kindness and respect. There are a few rules of engagement in the chat box, so everyone feel free to ask questions, but we do want everyone to feel welcome in these spaces and for everyone's voices to be heard. So please bear this in mind when engaging with the chat. For this reason, we ask that you don't use inappropriate, rude or unkind language and don't spam. Participants who violate these principles may be prevented from further posting in the chat box. That being said, we really encourage you to ask questions to our speakers so we can include them in our Q&A session towards the end. We're going to have plenty of time for questions, so please feel free to fire away. So let's start. Each of our speakers is going to have just over 10 minutes, and then we'll have a short 5-minute break. After that, we'll have time for the panelists to answer your questions. As you probably already know, we have an incredible panel lined up for you, featuring Veronica from the Nanny Solidarity Network, Nina from the Global Climate Strike, Alexa from Fuel Poverty Action, and Catherine from the Care Collective. So we're going to start with Veronica.
Global Women's Strike.
Oh, sorry about that. Veronica is the director and co-founder of the Nanny Solidarity Network, which is currently working to formalise a union branch for nannies with the IWGB. Veronica is also involved with the Fight for Childcare campaign. So over to her.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I've rushed back from nannying, which I feel like is very on brand. I'm from the Nanny Solidarity Network and also from the Fight for Childcare, which includes Send Crisis, Tower Hamlets, public early years and nurseries campaigns in Salford, Tower Hamlets, Birmingham and Thanet. And what we've done is we've begun to develop a manifesto and some key demands to get behind as a sort of national coalition that we can develop together and that we hope will be supportive, a campaign on agreed priorities and bring attention to the various crises in the childcare sector at the moment. I imagine, so I guess when we're talking about the intersections of climate and care, I really think we need to sort of start by unpicking what's happened in lockdown. And we know in lockdown that we've seen with the childcare industry, we've seen a sector that was already, like the NHS, really, really overstretched, just reach crisis point. Similar to the NHS, again, it's imperative that we have childcare in order for an economy to function. I think we learned that a lot with people working from home and not being able to access things like nurseries or in-home care in the same way. We also know that nurseries are 87% privatized, and this is, the market is dominated by big groups such as Busy Bees, Bright Horizons, who the wealth isn't trickling down there and it isn't reaching the nurseries. So we are actually seeing, really underfunded private nurseries. We've also seen nursery workers who, you know, due to various loopholes are being paid minimum wage and sometimes under minimum wage in the event of things like apprenticeships. We also see a workforce that is dominated by young women under 30, and in the case of au pairing, women under 25. So there's pay inequity across the board there. What we've also seen with home workers is, a huge amount of home workers or nannies and au pairs make up a part of the informal economy, which is, up to 2 million people in the UK. And nannying is really interesting in how it intersects with housing and also migration. So we've seen a lot of homelessness as well as joblessness. So across the board, it's been a really catastrophic time for people working in childcare. And I think that it's really important to take this opportunity and think about how we can rebuild in a different way, because the current system and the market monopoly that we've got with private nurseries, private agencies, is just not sustainable. Now, when we're talking about climate and COVID, and I feel like this might be a bit of an optimistic outlook to have, but I almost want to think about what we've actually got right. And what that is that, with lockdown, we saw a reduction in April of carbon emissions across the globe, 17% of CO2 emissions, daily CO2 emissions. And in individual countries, it was averaging out at a 26% reduction. And I think that has a lot to do with decentralizing our market economy. And I think that's really important to consider. What we saw is people who were no longer commuting into London, people from commuter towns around London were putting money back into their local economies and reducing their emissions at the same time, obviously with things like transport and, so on and so forth. But I think instead of sort of thinking about, obviously it's been a really catastrophic year for everyone. But I think with regards to the climate, it's about seeing the change that we've been able to make in such a short amount of time and seeing how we can bring that forward. So I think we've also seen a greater shift in things like we've got greater support from the state than we have in a really long time. We've seen a shift in the decentralizing the employment market. We've seen a lot of people working from home, a lot of remote working, and a lot of jobs now being advertised are remote. And so I think all of these things can only be good for our environment and good for creating a more sustainable way of life. So I think when we need to think about funding childcare, we need to consider that a green job in and of itself, because childcare is the scaffolding that allows flexible working, decentralized working to occur, and putting money in that can only be good for our environment and for sustainability. I think that childcare in this way needs to really be considered in part of the as part of the sort of green recovery deal. So NEF has done some amazing work with their childcare infrastructure fund, which talks a lot about subsidizing supply as opposed to demand, which means that we would remove tax credits for parents, and instead we would subsidize a standardized wage across the sector for all Ofsted registered childcare workers. And I think if we take, this is amazing, and this is by sort of like Lucy Stevens and Miranda Hall at NEF and some other people that I've probably forgotten. But I also think that what could aid in this decentralization of our economy would be to incentivize workers to start working outside of the capital. And I think a great way to do that is to abolish Ofsted registration fees. And what this would do would be to bring workers back into the sector. We know that the childcare industry is made up of a lot of young women, as I said before, and I just think people coming out of school, coming out of university are going to be less inclined to take on jobs where they can't socially distance. So if we want to see a decentralized market in which our environment is preserved and money is put back into local economies, I really think that incentivizing workers by abolishing Ofsted registration fees and doing things like subsidizing supply is going to be the way forward on that. I'm also thinking of things like, sorry, I was getting a lot of messages at once. I'm also thinking about things like, again, Lucy Stevens at NEF did an amazing nursery co-op in Deptford in London, which is basically parents can contribute on a sort of rota basis to the care and subsidise their own fees that way. And what we're seeing is longer, more flexible hours offered for parents. Often in-home childcare is taken on as sort of wraparound care as nursery hours, specifically private nurseries get shorter. And I think that if we're going to see people working from home in a way that's more sustainable, we're going to need to see more flexible hours, and flexible hours subsidized. At the moment, we have a really stringent sort of a certain amount of hours we can access for childcare per week, and that doesn't necessarily cover in-home care in the same way. I know that as a nanny, I'm eligible for the 15-hour subsidization with Ofsted, not the 30-hour. And I think by subsidizing across the board and allowing for that flexible care and allowing for flexible in-home care, we're going to see people, able to work more flexibly. We're going to be able to see people working from their houses, and we're going to definitely see commuting emissions and things like that come way down. So we're also going to see things like obviously Pret and Costa and Starbucks and all that stuff getting a lot less money. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of where my head's at. That's what the Fight for Childcare is thinking about and putting proposals forward for. We're trying to, at the moment, get our heads around some really concise points that we can really drive forward. We need to keep working with parents and workers together to bring this forward. And it's all really exciting. I really think that this is a one of a kind opportunity to really rebuild what this looks like and sort of start again from the ground up. So. If you'd like to join as a representation from an organisation or simply to support our efforts, please email postpandemicchildcare@gmail.com, and I'll put that in the chat as well. And I hope I haven't gone on too long, but thank you so much for having me, everyone.
Thank you so much for that. That was really incredible. That was a really nice contribution. Next, we're going to move on to Nina. Nina, originally from Argentina, is a joint coordinator of the Women's Strike, and she is a contributor to the Green New Deal for Europe, which proposes a care income as key to climate justice. So over to you. I think you'll have to unmute yourself, Nina.
Again, did it again. Sorry. I hope I'll be as good as keeping the time as the previous speaker, but you'll let me know. Okay, just to give a bit of background, the Global Women's Strike and women of color in the Global Women's Strike have been campaigning for financial recognition for unwaged caring work for nearly 50 years, since Selma James founded the Wages Passport campaign, which now coordinates the Global Women's Strike. In the 80s and 90s, we got the UN to agree that government should measure how much unwaged work women were doing and include its value in national accounts. And this has a lot to do with why now we have actually some figures, which Oxfam, for example, released early this year, about a huge amount of unwaged work that women are doing around the world. Now, our network is international. It's made up of autonomous organizations with their own constituency and demands, women of color, women with disabilities, sex workers, single mothers, LGBTQ, urban, rural. We all share a political perspective of financial recognition for unwaged caring work, but also of autonomy as the way to work together as a grassroots working class movement, while undermining the power relations of sex, race, and every discrimination among us. And we also work with men who agree with our perspective. In 2019, we became participants in the Green New Deal for Europe, which urges government to provide a care income for all those of every gender who care for people, for the urban and rural environment, and for the natural world. And this demand, which brings together the work of caring for people with the work of caring for the planet, is central to climate justice, and it makes the Green New Deal for Europe different from every other Green New Deal that we know of. In March, we started a campaign, we launched a campaign to make it global, because obviously we need it not only in Europe, but everywhere. Now, we have seen, as the previous speaker also spoke, how during the coronavirus epidemic, caring became central, really gained in visibility. But unless we talk about a wage, about an income for all carers, starting with mothers who are the first carers everywhere, and starting with the global south, we're not really serious. It's like clapping for the NHS workers and the care home workers who are keeping them on low wages and 0-hour contracts. It's like supporting Black Lives Matter while promoting stop and search and shoot to kill. It's just not serious. So we launched this initiative and we pointed out that the coronavirus pandemic came on top of a whole set of other pandemics. The climate pandemic, the poverty pandemic that has affected especially women, the war pandemic, the rape and domestic violence pandemic. And where single mothers in particular, but also disabled and older people have been hardest hit by all of these. And of course, especially in the global south and in communities of color in the north and immigrant and refugee communities everywhere. So at this critical moment, we feel that we must insist collectively on what we need, because we see that governments are already using emergency powers, and that's true here, but it's true everywhere else too, to transfer wealth from taxpayers to corporations, and even to impose more controls and surveillance on the rest of us and on our movements. The market values on wage work at $10.8 trillion, but it never suggests that women should get any of it. Instead, we're advised to get an education and a better paid job. But what about the indispensable work of life and survival, from breastfeeding to elder care? Only a care income can increase the status and the power of carers, and that is what we urgently need. To give you some idea, I want to tell you how people in our international network, the different organizations in it, have responded to a care income and why they support it. And I start with the Domestic Workers Trade Union in Peru, which is also part of the Global Women's Strike. They say, we work in our home and in the home of others. As a trade union, we campaign for legislation based on the ILO Convention 189, which recognizes us as workers with basic workers' rights. In fact, they have just succeeded in getting Congress in Peru to agree legislation that gives them all the rights that they were campaigning for. Unfortunately, the president has just been impeached, and therefore they're going to have to wait until that crisis is resolved for the legislation to be signed. They say we're also campaigning for a care income, a living wage for the work we do in our families and communities, for the environment and for human rights. Most of us who do it for others are indigenous women and girls who migrate from the countryside to the city and to another country. We create time for others to pursue their careers. But what about our families? Many of us work several jobs and are forced to leave our children at home on their own for long hours. With a care income, we could stop doing the triple day. The elimination of poverty must be a priority for all who claim to defend the rights of women. Without financial recognition for caring work, such elimination is impossible. The Thailand Southern Peasant Federation is saying we care for the land as we care for our family, and therefore a care income exactly suits the bill. The anti-mining community, an anti-mining community in Thailand, which is also part of this campaign, one of the women gives you some idea of her working day. I wake up at 2 o'clock to go and tap rubber from the trees for the plantation owner. By 6 a.m., I head home in time to get breakfast for my daughter and husband. The daily chores of keeping the house and working in the vegetable garden take up the afternoon. On most days, there will be some work for our campaign against the mining company who is intent on poisoning our soil and water. Sometimes soldiers or authorities come to check on me, which is intimidating. I go to bed about 9 p.m. This is the hour I do most of my worrying and planning. I worry about the future of my daughter. I worry about the poisons from the mines. I worry about our debts. I worry about whether I'll be able to have enough money for school fees, food, clothes. I worry about going to prison. I am awake 19 hours each day. 12 hours I spend doing the unwaged work of caring for others, my family, my community, the environment. What would a care income mean to me? Some people say time is money, and this money would give me time. Time to grow more food, time with my husband and daughter, time to strengthen the resistance to mining and other injustices. My family, sorry, my voice, I'm losing my voice. My family and our community would be more secure, and security brings dignity and freedom. Another woman who lives in one of the biggest slums in Bangkok says, I'm a single mother with 2 children with disabilities and an elderly mother who lives with us. I get up at 1 o'clock, cook rice and pork to sell later before doing my taxi job. I am a motorcycle taxi driver from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. every day. I take my daughter to school, which is far from our home. I sell sticky rice and pork outside the gates there. There are visits to the hospital. I am also the elected and unpaid chairperson of the 4-region slum network, which represents the millions of people who live in the slums. Every day there is work to do in our community fight against the threat of eviction and other issues of poverty and state discrimination. A care income would be a secure foundation for me. I could do more work of caring for my daughter and the community. This would be good for our family and good for society. Paying us a wage in cash or in housing would mean we could solve many of the problems of slums and poverty ourselves. We don't lack capacity, we lack money. And that is really the crucial statement there. Finally, the Global Women's Strike in Ireland has been campaigning for the Constitution, which at the moment acknowledges caring work that women do in the home, to be changed because the language is outdated and sexist. But the recognition is very important. And there were some feminists who wanted to take it out of the Constitution altogether. And we said, no, we want the recognition. The care income has now given us new impetus to demand that the Constitution be updated so everyone doing this work, of whatever gender, is afforded the dignity and financial support they deserve. My last point is that the Poor People's Campaign in the United States, which is a mass organization which involves about 3 million people in their last webinar, because they had a march from Washington organized, which had to be canceled, so they had it online, and they had 3 million people on it. A movement of millions led by those with least, who are mainly women of color, mothers, has endorsed the care income. And they also support a basic income, and they want a care income on top. And I think that gives you some idea that if you really want to put caring as central to the agenda, caring for people and the environment, and it is one and the same thing, you have to do it with cash and with resources. Otherwise, we're just talking. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nina. Next, we're going to hear from Alexa. Alexa Ward is an organizer and researcher, seems to be based in Edinburgh, and she's a director of Fuel Poverty Action, and she works on urban climate justice issues with a focus on housing and democracy. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Lola. And thank you both to Veronica and Nina. You've outlined some concepts so that I don't have to in my talk and can make it happen within the 10 minutes. So in 2010, Fuel Poverty Action, which is a small grassroots organizing group, was born out of Climate Camp, with the explicit focus of doing climate campaigning centered on social justice and lived experience. Ending fuel poverty, our ultimate goal, can have quite a boring definition: people not spending over X amount of household income on energy. That framing is useful insofar as it allows for the problem to be counted and shows us how pervasive fuel poverty is in the UK. Hint, very. However, when you start to define fuel poverty holistically, you can begin to see why I'm here this evening. Fighting to end fuel poverty means fighting for people to live in warm, safe homes that are good for their health and for the environment. It means fighting for homes and energy that are truly affordable and don't destroy the planet. It means tackling inequality so that people are not put in a position where they have to choose between heating and eating in the first place. And doing climate justice work through an issue that is so intimately connected to everyday life makes us committed to asking difficult questions, including questions around energy pricing and residents' priorities. We are also working towards democratizing the energy system, and a common thread through our work is getting people into corridors of power, either by arranging residents with broken heating systems to meet with bays, or through direct action, in both cases so that they can demand accountability. And just to give you a little bit more, a few more examples of what our work is, we had a Safe Cladding and Insulation Now campaign following the Grenfell fire, which was meant to ease the transition for residents who were living in tower blocks that had flammable Grenfell-style cladding into tower blocks that had safe, non-toxic cladding that was able to keep them warm in the winter. And we also have a few work streams that are working to close the gap between what is promised in green projects, such as housing retrofits and district heating systems, and the reality that is actually experienced by residents, which are often poor quality jobs that leave people worse off. We also focus a lot on energy pricing and advocating for systems that people can afford. I'm happy to have followed such excellent presentations by Veronica and Nina as campaigns for care income begin to illuminate how people end up in fuel poverty in the first place. Just to connect FPA's work to care work, I'm going to read our call for support for the 2017 Global Women's Strike. Fuel Poverty Action are a participating organization in this strike and have endorsed the call for living wage for mothers and other carers. The lack of recognition and lack of payment for the work of caring, primarily done by women, is a major cause of fuel poverty, particularly, but by no means, for single mothers, people with disabilities, and full-time carers. Then, when we get old, women's pensions often reflect the fact that many spend some years off work, but actually working really hard, raising families. So women pensioners get even less than men. Pensioners are the vast majority of thousands who die every winter because they cannot afford to heat their homes. The previous speakers have also illuminated how unpaid care work done in the home has increased over the course of the last 6 months and has disproportionately fallen on the shoulders of women. Here, I'm pulling statistics from a recent piece by Helen Hessler on women care work, COVID, and the 4-day work week, which demonstrated how unpaid care work and housework have been done by women during the pandemic. A recent report indicates that, regardless of their wage bracket, women working in the US, the UK, and Germany did more childcare than men with similar earnings. And a study from UCL found that women in the UK spent more than twice as much time as men on their children's development and homeschooling during lockdown. The lost real wages from unpaid care work during this period, which will be amplified by the recession, will have ramifications for fuel poverty for some time. But we've already begun working really closely with impacted communities. First and foremost, on pricing. At the beginning of lockdown, we went to work immediately to relieve the stress of energy bills for people struggling to afford them. It was a doubly challenging situation, rising unemployment and spending more time at home. So people had less money to spend on more energy used. And we wanted lasting bans on disconnections, support for people on prepayment meters, and to ensure that energy debt accrued during the pandemic was canceled. The stresses of unaffordable energy fall on residents doing most of the housework. As we've noted, that is most often women. The anxiety related to deciding whether or not you can afford to use the washer dryer or cook a big meal is a constant stress faced by carers living in fuel poverty. We've also, over the course of the pandemic, been working with residents at the Pendleton Together tower blocks in Salford, who are just now, over 3 years after Grenfell, having their flammable cladding removed. They were in lockdown in flammable tower blocks, and that took a massive toll on their mental health. And there was a lot of caring involved within the community for each other during this period, and by Fuel Poverty Action figuring out how to demand that cladding was removed. So answering some of the questions that Lola laid out in the brief, how have the crises of care and climate been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic? One thing for us is poor building standards. There are going to be more problems moving forward now that the government has chosen to decrease the amount of regulations on buildings. It'll be harder to close the gap between what people are promised and what they want and what they actually get. And the people who are going to be most impacted by those poor building standards will be the people who are doing care work at home. From a climate perspective, these projects also won't deliver climate wins. The building and construction process itself will be more emissions intensive, and the finished products won't deliver the savings that we want. Also, there's this issue of the floundering economy being used as an excuse to focus on jobs, including fossil fuel jobs, at all costs. We know, of course, this doesn't have to be the case, and the focus could address the twin crises of care and climate and propel us forward on an alternative trajectory where growth of any sort is not prioritized, but growth in the social fabric and within communities is. Which brings me on to the next point. What is the role of care in creating a sustainable society founded in climate justice? The role of recognizing care work in all its diversity, formal healthcare workers, formal and informal domestic workers, unrecognized and unpaid care work, caring for a sick friend, housework, cooking, and cleaning. So far, traditionally, green jobs in the just recovery have focused on manual labor and overlooked care work. This has changed in the last few years with excellent work being done to promote care work as green work. But still, these conversations more often focus on formal care work, such as healthcare workers or teachers or green jobs or social care workers, and leave out the piece that Nina was mentioning, what happens to unrecognized, unpaid care work. So I think we need to start thinking more about how to include that type of care work as a green job as well. And that comes through illuminating it. I think there's also little value attached to caring for the planet, as Nina also noted, cleaning up local environments after natural disasters, and doing other protective care work. One of the questions that was also asked as part of the brief was, what ways does our climate communication need to change to incorporate care work? Well, one of them is what I just mentioned, a just transition focused on workers, but one that counts care workers and unpaid care workers as part of that conversation. However, we can't really, as a climate movement, change what we're talking about unless we change how we're acting, which brings me to my last point. I'm no communication expert, obviously, but for FPA, our comm strategy, for better or for worse, has always been discussing what we do and dealing with issues of care as part of that work. And so I think that would be nice to see more broadly in the climate movement. Finally, and I hope this final thought transitions nicely into Catherine's more expansive conversation about how we can develop an ethic of care in society, I think we need to do climate justice organizing differently. We need to foreground lived experience and how the policies and programs that the climate movement is calling for actually land in people's lives, which requires us to pay a lot more attention to care and to the domestic. We also have to think about the pathways that got us to the climate solutions that do not center care. A lot of people have now done a lot of work to explain why technocratic market-based solutions fail to address the climate crisis. Many of you are in this room, but I also think we need to be thinking about how we arrived at those solutions that are insufficient, and how a feminist analysis and a feminist way of working could allow us to land elsewhere. The technocratic perspective on climate and governance is a view from above, and it gives us climate solutions that are incompatible with lived experience and experiences of care. So I would argue that Fuel Poverty Action's way of working could provide an alternative. It's feminist in its approach to change and its understanding of the climate crisis. It's focused on lived experience, on situated climate solutions, on centering on domestic, and all of these things have just become more important in the course of the last 6 months and provide potentially opportunities for us going forward.
Thank you, Alexa. Next, we'll be hearing from Catherine. Catherine Rottenberg is an associate professor in the Department of American and Canadian Studies at the University of Nottingham. She's also a member of the Care Collective, which has written the Care Manifesto, which is available just next week. It's available next Tuesday, the 22nd, from Verso. So over to her.
Hi, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm sorry if my video is on the corner of my computer, so I'm not quite looking at everybody in the room. And I also want to thank the previous speakers. What I want to do in the next few minutes is first to underscore how a politics of carelessness has led us to the devastating situation in which we find ourselves today. And I also want to outline very briefly a vision of what the world could look like if we were to organize it around care, not carelessness. We're too used to dystopic visions of the future, but here what I want to do is I want to offer a progressive and utopian one. I am part of a care collective that was created as a reading group in 2017. It's composed of academics and activists. And we came together to try to make sense of what we saw as the multiple crises of care already engulfing the world, rising inequality everywhere, endless war, the refugee crisis, and looming over everything, of course, ongoing climate change and imminent environmental catastrophe. And the Care Collective eventually decided to write the Care Manifesto, the politics of interdependence. And when we began, we could never have anticipated how urgent COVID would make our manifesto. And in the manifesto, we argue that the current global crisis is indeed a crisis of care. It's the result of decades of policies prioritizing profit over people and the reduction of more and more domains of our lives to a market logic. Years of austerity measures intensified deregulation and privatization, some of which we heard from the previous panelists, alongside the devaluing of care practices and care work, has meant that neoliberal nation states, and particularly countries like the UK and the US, have been utterly unable and even unwilling to cope swiftly or effectively with the spread of coronavirus. In the manifesto, we also argue that the devaluation of care has come about in large part due to care and caretaking's historic association with women, with women's work, and its perceived non-productive nature. I mean, after all, care and care work are precisely not about extractive capitalism. They're not about profit, but about cultivating and nurturing relationships toward others. So governments which have for too long based their policies on the needs of the few and on so-called economic growth have failed to respond adequately to the pandemic. Again, a politics of carelessness has reigned. And this, I think, has manifested itself very clearly in the UK over the past 6 months. The UK currently has the highest number of confirmed coronavirus deaths in Europe due to the government's multiple forms of carelessness. We know that the government refused to take heed of warnings about future pandemics following SARS and MERS. And the UK had already slashed hospital resources, including the number of nurses and hospital beds, nor did it respond to the coordinated EU strategies to provide personal protective equipment. And at the same time, or meanwhile, care homes were to a large extent abandoned. Untested occupants and workers were left exposed to the virus and treated with utter and criminal negligence. Deaths of their older inmates not even recorded in the announcement of COVID-19 mortality rates over the first 5 weeks. In other words, the COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically and dreadfully exposed this utter lack of care. But the pandemic has also exposed our profound interdependence. COVID-19 has highlighted our shared vulnerability and that the need for care is part and parcel of the human condition. So on the one hand, COVID has laid bare and, as we've heard, exacerbated the violence and devastation perpetrated by neoliberal markets, and has also laid bare the profound falsehood of neoliberalism's ideal subject, that self-sufficient and entrepreneurial individual, autonomous individual. On the other hand, it has reignited a conversation about care. Essential workers, not just doctors and nurses and home care workers, but bus and tube workers and garbage collectors and all those without whose labor society simply would not and cannot function, were showered with public appreciation. So if the pandemic has taught us anything so far, it is that we are in urgent need of a radically new politics that puts care front and center of life. But this new politics, needs to be one that does not just talk the talk, lionizing essential workers without paying them a living wage. It also has to be a politics that walks the walk. So COVID-19 has painfully reminded us just how vital robust care services and a care infrastructure are. And in the manifesto, we argue that we need to expand our understanding and politics of care. Care sheets of others. Rather, the vision that we're offering is one that advances a model of universal care, where care is understood as an enduring social capacity and practice involving the nurturing of all that is necessary for the welfare and flourishing of human and non-human life. So care is our individual and common or communal ability to provide the political, social, material, and emotional conditions that allow for the greatest possible people and living creatures on the planet, along with the planet itself, to thrive. And in the manifesto, we sketch out a vision of what the world might look like if care were its organizing principle. A caring world can only be built from the understanding that we are all dependent upon the systems and networks, animate and inanimate, that sustain life across the planet. So the building of a caring world begins first and foremost by recognizing that our survival and our thriving are everywhere and always contingent on others. It involves avowing our mutual interdependencies and embracing also the inevitable ambivalences at the heart of care and caregiving. So the notion of universal care that we develop calls for inventive forms of collective care at every single scale of life. Universal care means also ensuring that care is distributed in an egalitarian way, neither assumed to be unproductive and primarily women's work, nor when paid carried out by mostly poor immigrant and women of color. So across different scales of life, from our most intimate to the planetary, our vision translates into reimagining the limits of familial or family care to embrace more promiscuous models of kinship. It translates into reclaiming forms of genuinely collective and communal life. It translates into adopting alternatives to capitalist markets, reversing the marketization of care infrastructures, and it translates into restoring and invigorating and radically deepening, as well as transforming our welfare states. And then this leads us to the most expansive scale, the planetary. How can we create a more caring world, one that is capable of sustaining and nourishing all forms of life? So first and foremost, as we heard from Nina, it would mean rolling out a Green New Deal on a transnational level. The Green New Deal, as we know, involves transforming work patterns, both with the construction of green jobs and the reduction of the working week to expand our time and ability to care. But a transnational Green New Deal is not enough. We also need an array of transnational institutions and agencies whose organizing principles are based on care and caretaking, and not on predatory capitalism or financial imperialism. Caring for the world entails remaking and democratizing all international institutions and networks so that they facilitate the redistribution of the world's resources, enabling all states and the populations within them to build the caring and sharing infrastructure that they need to thrive. Building a caring world requires cultivating and embracing what we call an everyday cosmopolitan conviviality, one that moves our caring imaginaries beyond our kinship structures, our communities and our nation states to the furthest reaches of the strangest parts of the planet. So cosmopolitan subjects who are literally citizens of the world, are convivial, have care for the world at their heart, and recognize our ineluctable differences as well as our profound interdependencies. And this then brings us full circle, because it's only by valorizing rather than disavowing our global interdependencies that we can create any kind of caring world. And so in the last minute, I want to return to COVID-19 because I think that the current global, or we at the Care Collective thinks that the current global calamity constitutes a profound rupture. We know that many of the old rules no longer apply. We have to wear masks in public space, and governments can change our reality in a blink of an eye, as we saw with the imposition of lockdown. And yet powerful corporations have often been the first to profit from the disasters their careless ways have helped to produce and exacerbate. We see this happening today, and yet historically, the opposite has also been true. Ruptures have paved the way for radical progressive change, as happened in the wake of World War II with the growth of welfare in many Western states and with successful independence struggles in former European colonies in Africa and elsewhere. And the challenge today, as we in the Care Collective see it, is to build upon those earlier moments of radical change and those progressive visions to wrest back control from the power-grabbing 1% and their tyranny of social carelessness. During COVID-19, care for the vulnerable has been taken seriously by large swaths of the population, but we think this will disappear overnight till the next crisis unless we start building more enduring and participatory infrastructures of and for care at every scale of life. Thank you. I think we've lost Lola, and I think we're having some technical difficulties here.
Oh, there she is.
Hi. Yeah, I had a power cut at the best time. Thank you so much to Catherine and all the rest of our speakers. Unfortunately, Veronica won't be able to join us for our Q&A, but after the break, we will be hearing from Nina, Alexa, and Catherine. So make sure to send us your questions so we can address them in the second half. See you then. Welcome back, everyone. So we're going to start with our questions. Make sure to keep your questions coming. So the first one is about this emerging conflict that we're seeing, that I've been seeing in the UK and that we're seeing across the world, which is essentially trying to impose a dichotomy between prioritising care workers, particularly formal care workers, and prioritising a society founded in independence and ethic of care, and prioritising the economy on the other side. So how can we challenge this dichotomy and essentially, how can we challenge this dichotomy? Maybe we can start with Catherine.
So I think that my sort of instinctive response would be to say that we have to rethink what we mean by the economy, right? So that this kind of dichotomy exists in large part because we think of economies as about growth and profit. And once we sort of challenge that notion of the economy, then I think that the binary or the opposition between the economy versus care becomes unintelligible. So I think that one of the things that we need to do is think about what we mean by the economy. And here we know very well what the government means by the economy. And we have to offer alternatives to the capitalist or neoliberal market that currently exists. So that would be my...
Alexa, can I hand that question over to you?
Sure. I'm not sure I have much more to add than what Catherine's outlined, because that is the main way to challenge the dichotomy, to prove it's a false one, that you're not needing to choose these things over one another. I guess in the case of care work and income for care work, none of these conversations we're having about this are new. They're new to me because I wasn't alive in the 70s, but I've been going back and reading old writings now, from Selma James, for instance, who spearheaded the Wages for Care Work campaign. And one of the things that she says quite obvious, lays out, is the need for backing up this with numbers in the way that Nina has done, and showing sort of value of care work to the economy. It's kind of, you get yourself into a bind then, because you're at once trying to redefine what the economy is in the way that Catherine has outlined, but also trying to prove your worth in the binds of the other. And I think that's just a common struggle that we constantly have to grapple with pragmatically as organizers, but one that's worth discussing.
The next question, one that we've just got through from Karen on YouTube, is asking whether there are communities and places that we can see a politics of care in action, pockets of the future. Does anyone have a response to this? Maybe we can start with Nina.
You know, I think there is a lot of care in action. I'm sure people noticed it during COVID. It was quite obvious, you know, even on the street, you know, we all got leaflets through the door saying, do you need any help, etc. You know, here we are. So there was a lot of that going on. But I think we shouldn't glorify that, because at some point I was in another discussion where somehow that was being glorified over the need for a care income. Because in the global south, in Argentina, for example, where I come from, but all over the global south, frankly, if you don't support each other, you don't survive. You know, but that's just not enough. We don't want to survive at that level. That's what we're asking for, a care income, because we want the power to actually be able to transform our lives and our communities, to move away from degrowth. But in order to move away from economic growth and look at degrowth, which is one way that some feminists are putting it, and to put care central. But in order to do that, you just need the money, you need the resources, you need to change the economy. You know, you cannot bypass it. You know, we are fighting an election with Trump in the US right now. Do you know what I mean? Who doesn't even believe in climate change, who's a complete racist and sexist. If he gets elected again, you can bypassing is just a dream. You have to actually tackle the powers that are, exploiting us and destroying our planet. And therefore, we have to get our hands on those resources. And anybody who just thinks that somehow it's enough to talk and make it all sound very nice and it's all going to be communal, it's just not like that. Either we get the resources or they're going to war, they're going to exploitation, they're going to mining, they're going to all these things, especially in the South, but not only, in our communities here in the North as well.
Thank you for that. Alexa, do you want to offer an answer to the question of whether there are communities and places where we can see a politics of care in action?
I'm not sure I have that much more to add other than looking in plain sight. I mean, I think Nina's point about not glorifying that is very important, but I think looking in plain sight for inspiration of how we can imagine different futures is an important part, because then people can have tangible things that are part of their everyday life that they know and sort of reorganize them and rescale them as part of a project like Catherine's talking about. I wish I had, look up this cool case study of this, but maybe other people on the call can enter those into the chat.
Yeah, I guess what you said raises another interesting question about how can we, and Nina raised it, about how we can resist the attempts to kind of lionize care, but in a sense make it something which people just do out of the goodness of their heart, because in these times it's kind of necessary. And how can we really transition to seeing care as something which is respected? This is obviously something which is a really long discussion and fundamental to everything which we've been talking about, but that kind of central thing that we're seeing more in the time of coronavirus, which is clapping for carers but not actually giving them money. How can we move and center talking about care in a way which is prioritizing people being valued for their care? This is a massive question. It encompasses everything you've been saying, but I think we can touch on that more. Maybe if we start with Catherine.
So I'm just going to make a plug for reading the Care Manifesto, because what we do there is precisely to lay out from the most intimate relationship. So how can we rethink and restructure our notions of family, for example, through caring communities, what it means, and by looking at communal communities or cooperatives that have been successful, even just temporarily. I think they're important lessons going forward, and also resources to draw from as we think about ways of transforming our society from our notions of kinship to our notions of what it means to care for the planet. So I think here we give lots of examples, both from the past, but also going to the mutual aid societies that developed. And while I agree that we shouldn't over-valorize the mutual aid societies, but I do think that they both show how cooperation can operate, even as it happens during a crisis and when the state withdraws, right? So the answer is not sort of voluntary associations, but of course it is about resources and redistribution. But I think that it's also a moment where care is visible in ways, care in its various manifestations, not just care, hands-on care, is visible in various ways. And we need to use this moment to begin thinking together about alternatives, which is not enough just to say we need to pour resources into it. That doesn't actually change the structures in place at the moment. So that would be my.
Thank you. So next, Emmett on YouTube has asked the following question, which is that care is undervalued in neoliberal societies. In what ways do you feel we change the value of caring roles in society at large? For example, through arts, community development, or social eating projects? Maybe we can start with Nina.
Okay, well, art can always help in all kinds of ways. The movement has songs, the movement has paintings, the movement has all sorts of things, posters, whatever. You know, we did an exhibition many years ago, which was Who Works for Me? And it was children's paintings of the caring work that was done for them in their home. And it was absolutely fantastic. First of all, the paintings were beautiful. As you know, Picasso said it taken them decades to paint like a child again. You know, children, you go to a school and the paintings of the children are absolutely glorious. And it was just fantastic how they observed what was being done for them and how they appreciated. And it was absolutely a work of art. So this is just one example that we did many years ago. And you can do all kinds of things without. I think it's really important to make caring visible, because without visibility, obviously, you can't really deal with it. But visibility, you're never going to make it really visible unless it's waged. I'm afraid that is the story. And we kid ourselves if we think that visibility is enough, because you do have to change economic priorities. And art can definitely help to publicize, circulate, give us songs, give us all the instruments that we need as a movement to promote what we're fighting for and to promote what we're doing. You know, women are doing fantastic work, and not only women, of course, all genders, but women in particular, since we are, the first carers, especially as we become mothers. And I think that work has to be recognized. I think all the justice work that women are doing, I'm sure it hasn't escaped people that the young Black women in all the Black Lives Matter protests have been absolutely prominent. It's been extraordinary how young Black women have really taken the lead in the protest everywhere, but especially in this country, it's been very clear. And that's because justice work, in a way, is an extension of caring work. And I think we women are more trained to doing it. And we don't want to give up on that training. We just want others to get the training too. We don't want to be the only carers. We want everybody to do that caring work. But you have to change the economic priorities. You can't just get away from that. By the way, somebody in the chat from Black Lives Matter West London wants to be in touch to work on focusing on a care income. And please do get in touch with women of color in the Global Women's Strike and the Global Women's Strike. We'd love to meet and discuss how to move this forward. We're really delighted that you wrote that.
Yeah, they asked what's the best way for grassroots groups to start the work on focusing on a care income, asking for themselves and for other grassroots groups across the UK. Well, so maybe we can, maybe we can start with Nina. Do you want to start on that one?
The first thing you can do is to sign the care income open letter. If you go to Care Income now, you'll find it online, and then please absolutely get in touch. We're going to be pushing this much more strongly just now. And Selma James has a book coming out next year on all this, which we've been working on, which has a bit delayed us in some other campaign because we've been quite tied up with it.
And on that point, I would also just say, start bringing it up in more conversations. When you're talking about green jobs, and we get to the level where care work is mentioned as a green job, mentioned that some care work isn't counted as a green job, and we need to count that as well. And if you're having these sorts of conversations, start infusing what we've talked about today into them, alongside doing what Nina said.
For sure. So next, we're going to move on something that Alexa had touched in her talk, but we're going to explore the role of care in natural disasters. So obviously, as we know, the climate crisis is causing a dramatic increase in the amount of natural disasters that we're seeing. And how can we centre care in the discussions in the aftermath of natural disasters and in talks about the prevention of natural disasters? Maybe we can start with Alexa on that one.
Yeah, so I'll just expand upon or reiterate what I had mentioned briefly when I spoke, which was the work of caring for areas after natural disasters happen is care work as well. It's caring for the environment, it's caring for the planet, but there's also the social dimension of that it's not just the built infrastructure or homes that are impacted when natural disasters hit. It's our community resilience, it's our families, it's our everyday life, it's how living looks. And as part of that, care is obviously essential. But if we only focus on the care to clean up afterwards, we're missing the bigger part of the picture, which is building resiliency within communities such that when those hit, we already have the mutual aid groups started. We already have the care networks. We already have alternative modes of kinship that we can rely on to get through those tough times, which are coming. And I think thinking about that also forces us to ask a question of who is doing this care work. And we know that this is right now so disproportionately falling on the lives of Indigenous people, of BAME people, of women, and the proactive care work and prevention of disasters is also happening. I'm thinking from a Canadian context, the sort of work preventing massive oil spills and trying to not have pipelines be built like that had gone on in Wet'suwet'en earlier this year, is a thought that was being led by Indigenous people on so-called Canada, and they will also be the communities that will be impacted if and when there are an oil spill. And so by centering care work in both the prevention and building of resilience and of valuing the cleanup work after, we also need to be asking who's doing that question and how all of us can be supportive.
Yeah, over to you, Nina.
Yes, on the natural disasters, I think there's, natural disasters all have a political and economic dimension. We've been working very closely with Haiti. And as you know, they had this, horrendous earthquake in 2010, which killed about 300,000 people. I mean, it was one of the most horrendous natural disasters. But then there were all the politics behind it. There was the fact that the US came in with their army right away, but they didn't do anything for the people. There was the fact that the NGOs got huge amounts of money. I mean, they got literally billions of dollars from us, from all of us. People felt very strongly about supporting Haiti. It was quite extraordinary in this country because people donated enormously, even though they knew very little about Haiti. But all that money got completely stolen and squandered, so that the Haitian people got absolutely nothing for it. The Clintons were building themselves a hotel. They've been very involved. The Clintons have been very involved with sweatshops in Haiti. And there's all these politics behind it. And then there was the scandal with Oxfam and, the sexual abuse and all of that went on. So I think we just also have to, call it on the corruption of the NGOs, because they benefit from natural disasters. They benefit from poverty. That's what they get their money and make their living out of, not ending it, but keeping it going and keeping the natural disasters going too. So we have to really make sure that our result, that we follow what the politics are in every particular situation, and that the money goes where it should go, that it goes to the people that need it, and it goes to those grassroots organizations that are not corrupt and that are not taking a cut and are not benefiting from the disasters. Otherwise, it's a perpetual story. The same with what's going on in Palestine, for example. And there's very good news today, which is that the TUC passed a motion calling Israel an apartheid state and supporting boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is a major step forward in opposing what's going on there.
Lola, can I just jump in? And I want to say, I think that both Alexa and Nina answered the question, as comprehensively as it's possible to. But I also think that these natural disasters, we can't be reactive only, which is that it's clearly that the natural disasters have been exacerbated by human-made climate change, human-made, and putting profit over people. But they also, there needs to be not only a response to these disasters, which have care front and center in all the various ways that I tried to outline, not just making sure that the people who've been worstly or most affected by the natural disasters are cared for and their voices heard. But I also think that in terms of preemptive stuff and preventative, that it's really crucial to start talking, as Alexa said, and infusing and inserting a language of care. Again, not just care in hands-on care, but the care that I tried, the universal care model in every dimension of our lives. And that needs to, it's begun on some very small level with COVID. And I think we need to continue and to expand that discussion and that language and that discourse.
Could I add something to that? Sorry, it's just that we need to include, whoops, I'm getting a bad echo. We need to include war and armed conflict in all our discussions, because the Pentagon is actually the worst polluter in the world. But when you look at climate change agreements and all of that, they keep war out of those agreements, despite the fact that when you destroy a country like Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria, what do you think has happened to the environment? You know, how does it feed into climate change? How does it feed into everything that we're actually fighting against? So war has to enter those discussions. And again, it goes back to politics. You know, you just can't avoid it and, you know, skirt the issues. You really have to go for it.
Totally. So we're going to run through a couple more questions. And then once we get to the end of that, we're going to wrap up. So there's a few questions left. So the first is from Emmett on YouTube. And the question is essentially asking whether care income actually, even for informal carers, is not just a neoliberal way of dealing with the issue. Would it not be more socially and environmentally sustainable to provide universal services for all? So if we can hand it over to Nina first.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm definitely not against universal services for all. We like to have all the universal services possible. A care income is on top of that. It's not instead of. You know, at the beginning of the last century, Eleanor Rathbone fought for what then became child benefit. It was the first measure of the welfare state. And, you know, there was a whole set of opposition that somehow it wasn't a good idea to give money to women. What were they going to do with it? They weren't going to know how to spend it properly. Just pure sexism, really. And in fact, it was one of the best measures against poverty that ever came up, and one of the best measures of the welfare state. And it was universal. So the idea that a care income is just a neoliberal way, you know, you wouldn't go to a factory worker and say you should work for free because getting a wage is really a neoliberal thing. The fact is, if you're doing work, it should be recognized. Caring work is the most anti-capitalist work, and prioritizing caring work is really an anti-capitalist agenda. And if carers, all of us who are carers, had a lot more power in society, we would be able to change the political and economic priorities away from capitalism. So we don't see it as a capitalist thing. We see it as a tool, a crucial weapon against capitalism, a crucial weapon to reorient the whole economy and the whole politics.
Thanks for that. Next, we're going to address the question of how we can resist the attempts of our governments to use this crisis to crack down and entrench current systems. Does Catherine want to start with that?
Well, first of all, we have to, again, it's about, that's the $1 million question. How do we do it? And we all have to think about ways that we can be effective as community activists, as scholars, as people who are interested in social justice. And I think that one of the things that we need to do is to maintain the momentum that has emerged in the wake of COVID-19. And again, it's about collaboration. It's about the coordination of various grassroots organizations that are already working and ensuring that we are working on some level together in order to fight some of the re-entrenchment and even worsening of situations, right? So we see what's happening in the UK, we see what's happening in the US. And at first there was state intervention, sometimes at levels that we were surprised by. I never thought that certain governments, especially in Trump administration, would actually invest money in social infrastructure, and we saw it happening. So, and yet on the other hand, we see the outsourcing and the ways in which a lot of that money is actually going already to the 1% and not to the people who need it. So I also think that the shift in conversation, the media, there are ways in which these small things that we can do are crucial for helping to maintain the momentum. And also the vision that we present in the part of what we try to do. It's not, I think that the discussions around wages for housework, they've been around for a very long time, as Alexa said, and it feels sometimes like we're returning to conversations that we've had in the past. And I think we need to broaden the conversation, and we need to think of alternatives, not just sort of reforms, but really utopian visions which are hard to come by, but that will help us think about, okay, this is where we would love to be. How do we get there on these different levels?
Can I interject on that one? Sorry, wages for household. Let's not get into a whole thing about it, but it's not a reform. I think if you think it's a reform, then you really don't know a lot about the wages for household campaign and the campaign for a care income. But returning to your question, I think it's very important to bring movements together, and the autonomous organizing of different sectors is crucial to that. There's the Black Lives Matter movement, there's the youth strike, there's all the movements that are happening around climate change and around all kinds of issues of justice and economic justice, as well as against repression, for justice against rape and domestic violence. And it was very encouraging to see that a lot of the young Black women who were involved in the Black Lives Matter movement here were in fact people who had been involved in the youth strike for climate. Some of them got their political training there, so that by the time they were campaigning on this, they already knew a whole set of things about how to mobilize and do things, which was fantastic, the way one movement feeds into the other and because it's really one movement, We all are trying to change the world away from capitalism destruction. Greta Thunberg finally came out against capitalism. She's a fantastic person. And she realized that she was never going to achieve any change under the present climate. It just isn't going to happen. And that something else and something much bigger is needed. And she called it. And that's what we all have to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to center the interconnectivity. Alexa, do you want to answer the question of how we can resist attempts from our government to use this crisis to crack down and entrench the current system?
I don't have that much more to add because it's hard. And I guess my answer would be in line with what Catherine and Nina have already said, but that it needs to happen at all fronts. So whether you're doing community organizing work, whether you're getting an extra interview slot on BBC to show why the sorts of dichotomies choosing between economy and the other alternative vision that we're putting forward are false. Just needing to bring that point home in all of these different ways. Yeah, I don't know. I think I had read a few pieces that I guess at the beginning of the pandemic, I found it somewhat hopeful when people were talking about this as a turning point, as a point to reimagine some other future, as a point where something could be different. And then I read a few critiques of that pointed out, hey, we've done this like every single time, every year for like the last however long. And so I think there's also a danger of falling into this, thinking this is a turning point, because there was also 2008, and there was also this, and there was also this. And I think there's value then in seeing it as sort of a continuous and historical struggle, which is what our other speakers have been outlining today as well. So yes, we need to try to seize the moment, but we're also, it's a moment. There's a lot of other moments. They're all connected together.
Yeah, I love when you say that you don't have anything to add because everyone's already said anything, and then you say something that people really need to hear. So thank you for that. The next question is from Theodora on YouTube, and she's asked, what inroads has the feminist degrowth movement made within Labour in terms of breaking with the nexus of an infinitely grown economy and the development of productive forces and wage work? So Nina, do you want to start?
That's a hard one. Well, what inroads? I think Labour has been quite stuck on the whole idea of growth, and that is definitely a major problem. I think under Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, there was a real possibility with the whole issue, with the fact that they took climate change very seriously, that they were obviously wanting to develop green jobs rather than other kinds of jobs. There was a real possibility. Now we just have to see what's going to happen. I mean, most of us don't think much of Keir Starmer. I know many people have resigned since Keir Starmer became the leader of the Labour Party. We've had at the Women's Centre, one of the organizations based there is Women Against Rape. Women Against Rape had various dealings with Keir Starmer when he was the Director of Public Prosecutions. Didn't think much of him then. I was one of the people who met him at the time. He refused, for example, to stop prosecuting women who were accused of making a false allegation, women whom we knew were telling the truth, some of them who were sent to jail after being attacked by strangers and given very long sentences. He refused to do anything about that, but at the same time, he put himself forward as, this champion of victims. He's since reversed, sided with the Indian government, a fascist, racist government in relation to Kashmir on doing some of the stuff that, the good work that the Labour conference had actually done. So he's, the Black Lives Matter have attacked him for calling another movement by the moment, which he then apologized for. He said he's very, very close to the police. He was involved in not prosecuting the police when they killed Jean-Charles de Menezes. He had an opportunity to reverse an earlier decision and refused to do so. So it's not looking very good. But the TUC, as I said earlier, came out with this motion, which has taken decades, against Israeli apartheid. So that is very good. And they are obviously connected with Labour Party. And I know that there are many people in the Labour Party who are continuing to fight for the manifesto that was put together under Jeremy Corbyn. But, degrowth, well, they're developing HS2, aren't they? And they didn't oppose it. And there's a big movement against that.
Yeah, Catherine, do you want to respond to this question?
I have less to say about Labour per se, although I do agree with most of Nina's analysis of where, in terms of the manifesto and in terms of the current leadership. But I think it's very, very difficult, given the context in which we live, to get away from economic growth. I mean, we have sort of left intellectuals and scholars and economists who have offered alternatives, but to be a political party, as we've seen with the way in which there was the ousting of Corbyn after the loss, it's a very difficult discussion to insert into the current context where everything is about economic growth. return to Nina's comment about wages for housework, because the fear with speaking to activists and also the caring income is that what will happen is that the problem will be reduced to an economic frame. And so that was what I'm referring to. And I think that the problem is much greater than just capitalist society. And that's why the whole question of care as an organizing principle has come in. So that, just leave it at that.
Alexa, do you want to respond to this comment about degrowth?
Yeah, similarly, I don't have much to say on the labor front, but I think the things that I found most useful in thinking about this question have been discussions about why the type of growth we're talking about needs to change. And there's been some very good work on that, why we're not needing to think about GDP in terms of economic growth, but can we think about growth within communities? And then people can satisfy their desire to have growth, but maybe that's the growth in their interpersonal relationships or networks or resiliency. And so that's a useful strain of thought to look into. And then I guess the other thing to note on that is, I guess it was last autumn, Matt Huber came out with an article about against austerity environmentalism and how the framing of environmentalism as needing to decrease what you have now doesn't resonate with huge swaths of people who don't have enough right now. And so the framing of degrowth being really incompatible with that, especially if we're trying to win a widespread movement for environmentalism, we don't want to frame it in terms of austerity. And I know when you read into degrowth, that's not what people are saying, but when you're talking about things in snippets and tweets, that's how things can be read. So those are the two sorts of things that I've been thinking about in relation to this.
Yeah, thank you for those responses. The next question is from Susie on YouTube. And she says that there is a major crisis of childcare increasing day by day. How do we mobilize when the state withdraws? Maybe we can start with Catherine.
Well, I think we've heard some of the ways in which people are organizing, whether it's with the nannies or with other, grassroots organizations who are exactly fighting. Where's the question again, so I can stay on focus? It was up. But I think that the other problem is that, at least this would be my take, and of the Care Collective, is that we have to ensure that the state does not withdraw, because it cannot be the NGOs or even community activists that ultimately can solve the problem of childcare, of the childcare crisis. So while these organizations, we absolutely have to get involved and to support them in any way we can, we also have to insist that the state we reimagine the state, and that it re-enters the social welfare in all of its aspects.
I agree that we have to keep putting pressure on the state. We can't allow them to just withdraw from their responsibilities. The woman who spoke, the first speaker who spoke about, childcare and all that. I mean, that the childcare has to be provided. The care income also has to be provided. I saw that in France, the government is planning to pay parents an income if they have to stay at home to look after their children. The first thing is not to be impoverished by a situation that's being imposed on us. And also and a lot more pressure has to be put on the government to do something about the carers at work, the NHS, the care homes. They've killed tens of thousands of people, many of whom should not have died if the protective equipment and everything that people were asking for had been provided. And also, if those care workers were not temporary, 0-hour contracts workers going from one care home to another and being allowed to go in when nobody knew whether they carried the virus or not. That's genocide against all the people, is what's happened in this country. And in other places too. This is not the only one.
Thanks. So the next question is from Theodora on YouTube. And she says, crucial for all the above is the socialization of the economy, not by state ownership, but by networks of self-managed industries, consumer cooperatives, and collectivized municipalities. So moving on from what we've just said about the state, does Alexa maybe want to tackle this question?
Yes, I think one of the ways I'm going to tackle this question is referring people to other talks that have gone on within TWT already. There's been workshops on municipalism, workshops on how to create the sorts of things mentioned here. I think there is a gap, though, and I've been thinking about this and was thinking about this last autumn when I was like, oh, it'd be really cool now that like energy would be nationalized. Amazing. And I was like, okay, so like, then how does that look like if we're transforming that into cooperatives? And right now, the sort of model of cooperatives is still a really privileged one, such that a lot of energy cooperatives traditionally have been very white spaces, very middle class spaces. And I think there's some hard questions we need to ask about how to make those spaces not like that. For instance, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is energy cooperative that came out of the original New Deal, is quite racist and like not based on great principles and has a lot of fossil fuels. And so I think there's a gap there and that we need to address what it looks like when these sorts of things we're asking them to be socialized, but also what are the tools that we're using? And that's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that response. So as a final question, someone on YouTube asked what they can do to tackle these issues. And so can we just get like a final response from everyone on what actions they think individuals who are watching and who watch this in the future can take to tackle these issues and these connected crises of climate care and COVID-19? Maybe we can start with Alexa.
Okay, the perennial question of individual versus collective action. Obviously, act collectively, join these movements that we've all been describing, join the imaginings of what those futures look like. But I think in care, more than other places, there's a really big role for developing care networks and relationships within your own life that challenge traditional models of kinship, so that as things become more challenging, I know from the experience of the last 6 months, those interpersonal relationships really do matter. And so to think both in terms of your networks that you feel on an everyday immediate basis, but also joining those movements that are demanding these larger things.
Yeah, Catherine, do you want to tackle this question?
So I would just second what Alexa said, and I think that you need to get involved in any way you think you can or are able to on a collective level, on an individual level, either by reading, talking to people, reading. You know, there's lots of stuff coming out now on all of the issues that we've been talking about, climate change. There are lots of movements. So there are lots of things, small and large, that we can do as individuals and in collective concerted actions.
Yes, just I agree. There are many things that people can do, and you can, in a way, you can join a movement anywhere from your own situation. But we have a women's center, so I'm happy to advertise this as a point of contact. If you agree with anything that was said tonight, please come to the Crossroads Women's Center. There's a whole set of campaigning organizations based there that are campaigning on very many issues, but in an interconnected way, as collective self-help is what we call it, and we all help each other with our expertise. And we're involved with Black Lives Matter. We're involved against racism, against rape, against deportation, you know, many, many issues that all relate to building a caring society and opposing what's going on now. And of course, we're campaigning for a care income. So if you want to come and be with us, we'll be delighted.
Yeah, following on from what Nina just said, we're going to wrap up. So if any of you have anything you want to promote or want to direct people to in terms of organizations, in terms of things they can look at, your different works, maybe we can start with Alexa.
And one of the groups that uses the Crossroads Women's Center for meetings is Fuel Poverty Action. So we've got a lot of exciting work coming up at the intersection of care, social justice, housing, organizing, decarbonization, and several work streams. And we're always looking for more people to get involved and for more financial support, as we are an unfunded small organization. So I guess we have Twitter, we're using that a bit more. We have a website, and you can email us at fuelpovertyaction@gmail.com.
Brilliant. Over to Catherine.
So can I unabashedly promote the Care Manifesto? And it's very easy for me to do because I'm not the sole author. So it's not only about me, it's about the Care Collective. And it would be wonderful to begin this conversation about how care can be put front and center of our lives.
And finally, Nina.
Okay, my last promotion, apart from the Women's Center, if you want to read anything, Sex, Race and Class, The Perspective of Winning by Selma James. It's her anthology, and another one is due next year. So please just get a copy and come and see us. We'd love to see you.
Thank you. So thank you for those plugs, and thank you all for attending. We've had it's an honor to have such a wonderful panel of speakers to discuss this topic. So closing off, I just want to tell people that there is the TWT forum, and they can engage with all the issues that have been discussed at this panel and all the other discussions that have been taking place at TWT using the forum. If you've already set up your account, then you can click the link that's been posted in the chat to find the relevant discussion thread for this event. And if you are registered for the festival, you can check your email to find the sign-up link to the forum. If you're unable to find a sign-up link, please email info@theworldtransformed.org. Speaking about other events, of course, TWT is a month-long festival this year, month-long digital festival. And remember that there are loads of other events at the World Transformed that are filling up really quickly. So be sure to register for any that you'd like to attend. And to make sure that you register for the festival, you can go to theworldtransformed.org/register and then find the individual event page for the event that you'd like to attend and register on the programme. Finally, if you've enjoyed this session and you want to help us sustain our work throughout this festival and beyond, you please consider supporting us at theworldtransformed.org/support. And please continue to engage with all the recordings that have been taking place of events that have already taken place. And you can always come back to the recording of this event, which will be saved on the TWT YouTube channel. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you so much to all of our speakers for making such incredible contributions. It's been an honor to have you.
Thank you for your sharing, Lola. Thank you very much.
Fellow panelists.
View the full TWT 20 program and become a supporter today to help us deliver political education all year round at theworldtransformed.org.